Under the humming lights of Chicago O'Hare, a voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Sir, step aside. Now." Passengers turned. Some paused mid-stride. A TSA officer's hand hovered near his holster, and for a split second, the terminal froze around a single man standing at the pre-check queue, his boarding pass caught between two fingers. Henry Caldwell didn't flinch, but something in his eyes tightened just 1 millimeter, barely visible unless you knew how to read a man who'd spent decades holding empires together while the world tried to pull them apart. The officer wasn't looking at Henry's ID. He wasn't looking at the boarding pass either. He was staring at the slim silver case. Henry carried the same case Henry had placed on the belt countless times over the years. But today the scanner beeped. Not a shrill alarm, not a threat indicator. Just a glitch. A routine hiccup in a machine that had processed thousands of travelers before him. Yet the officer's voice rose sharp and absolute, as if the fate of the country depended on that moment. "Sir, place the case on the table." Slowly. Henry complied. Always calm, always deliberate. The kind of calm that unsettled men who thrived on intimidation. The officer popped open the case with a theatrical flick. Empty. Just a leather folder, a fountain pen, and a pair of reading glasses, wrapped in a soft cloth. The officer deflated his posture, sagging with embarrassment. He refused to acknowledge. "Run it again," he muttered. The conveyor belt hummed, the screen blinked green, and the machine chirped an all clear. The officer cleared his throat. "You can go. No apology. No explanation." Henry closed the case gently, as if protecting something fragile inside himself, rather than the objects it held. "Thank you," he said, voice low enough that only the officer heard the disappointment buried beneath. Behind Henry, a woman in a navy coat leaned toward her husband and whispered. Not quietly enough. He looked like trouble the moment he walked up. Henry heard her. He always heard them. But he kept walking. Terminal B stretched ahead of him like a long metallic canyon. The PA system droned flight numbers. Coffee machines hissed. Suitcase wheels tapped like nervous metronomes across the tile. Henry moved steadily through it. All his pace balanced his breathing even, but inside him, something trembled the way steel trembles under pressure long before it bends. He checked his watch out of habit, an old analog piece, nothing fancy, the kind worn by men who built things instead of flaunting them. He'd bought it before Caldwell Aerofleet existed, before anyone cared about his name, before his fleet shadowed the skies of half the country. Gate C-22 glowed at the end of the corridor. Overhead, lights flickered, as if nervous about what was coming. Emily Rogers stood behind the counter, shoulders tight ponytail pulled too high, trying to look confident in a job she hadn't yet grown into. The kind of kid who still said, "Yes, ma'am," to flight attendants twice her age, but had learned to mask her inexperience with clipped efficiency. When Henry stepped forward and offered his pass, her smile faltered. Not because of him, she wasn't the type to judge a man by his clothes. But her monitor was frozen, half the rows on her list were blank, and the gate behind her had been overbooked by 3 seats, thanks to a system update that crashed mid-upload. She swallowed hard. "Sir, could you hold on just a second?" Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. Henry waited. Patients like him didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Emily tapped keys with growing urgency. Nothing updated. The RAW for seat 1A flickered on and off like static. She chewed the inside of her cheek. Her tells were obvious. "I'm sorry, sir. The system's not verifying your seat yet." Henry studied her face, not the screen. Fear, not arrogance. That mattered. "Take your time," he said gently. His calm steadied her hands, but not her nerves. Behind him, passengers shifted, some irritated, some curious. A businessman in a camel coat muttered, "This always happens with these glitchy upgrades," though his eyes lingered a little too long on Henry's jeans and tired posture. Emily forced a breath, nodded once, and manually overrode the malfunction. The printer rattled, spitting out the paper stub for first class. She handed it to Henry with both hands, like she was offering more than a boarding pass. "Thank you for your patience. Have a good flight, Mr. Caldwell." He gave a brief, tired smile. "You too." But as he turned toward the jet bridge, another voice sliced the air lower, old astern enough to carve through steel. "Hold up. You didn't clear seat 1A properly." Linda Barrett approached like a slow-moving storm, her navy uniform pressed so crisply it looked dangerous to touch. The years had etched themselves into the corners of her eyes and the tight line of her jaw. She wasn't cruel by nature, just worn down by decades of mid-air emergencies, unruly passengers, and the endless grind of trying to keep order 30,000 feet above ground, where turbulence existed both inside and outside the cabin. Emily straightened, spine stiff. The system lagged, but I got the override. Linda folded her arms. "Did you verify the platinum rollover list?" Emily froze. The one list she hadn't checked. The one the training manual warned might glitch after updates. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Linda didn't wait. She pivoted toward Henry, eyes narrowing, not suspicious, but calculating. She'd seen men walk down jet bridges with first-class tickets they weren't supposed to have. Men accidentally upgraded during a system crash. Men moved from economy because of overbooking. She wasn't judging Henry, she was judging the computer. But the result felt the same. "Sir, I need to verify your seat again. Please step aside." A murmur rippled behind him. The businessman in the camel coat whispered, "I knew something was off." Henry stopped walking. His fingers tightened around the boarding pass, not with anger, but with fatigue. A long, bone-deep weariness that came from being questioned one too many times, in one too many terminals across one too many decades. He glanced at Emily, at her wide, uncertain eyes, and understood instantly it wasn't malice, it was fear of messing up. He stepped aside, quietly, gracefully, the kind of grace that irritated people who needed conflict to validate their authority. Linda leaned over the counter, scanning manually through the list, muttering each name under her breath. Nothing wrong. Nothing missing. She straightened, slowly realizing it, but instead of apologizing, she offered something colder, safer. "We're all set." Henry nodded once. No smile this time. But as he turned toward the jet bridge, a shout erupted from the concourse. A woman yelling for help. A suitcase toppled. A coffee cup shattered across the floor. A man stumbled backward, clutching his chest, gasping for air, while bystanders froze, unsure whether to intervene or step away. Emily's breath caught. Linda's instinct flared. Henry's eyes locked on the collapsing figure. Something in his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the dormant steel of a man who'd spent his life staying quiet until the world forced his hand. Because Henry Caldwell, the man no one recognized in jeans and a travel-worn coat, was not just the CEO of a powerful aviation conglomerate. He had once been an ER medic before the world turned him into something bigger, harder, sharper. And the past he'd buried for decades was about to rip its way back into the present, right there at Gate C22. The scream didn't rise. It collapsed, as if the man's lungs simply gave out under him. One moment he was standing near the newsstand, reaching for a bottled water, and the next he folded forward his knees, striking the floor with a dull thud. The terminal lurched into a strange, suspended quiet. A child stopped mid-sentence. A rolling suitcase spun off balance and toppled. Even the announcements overhead seemed to stagger for breath. Henry was already moving before the crowd understood what had happened. He cut through the ring of frozen onlookers, dropped to one knee beside the man, and set his case aside with the instinctive precision of someone who had once lived inside emergency rooms. The stranger's face had turned an alarming shade of grey. His fingers twitched against his chest, clawing for air he couldn't find. A woman, maybe his wife, hovered behind him, her hand trembling near his shoulder, but afraid to touch him. He said he felt dizzy, she whispered. And then Henry touched the man's wrist. No radial pulse. Or if one existed, it was buried deep, faint, a whisper in the bloodstream. He checked the airway next. Obstructed number chest movement, barely. Sweat gleamed across the man's forehead like a thin film of oil. Not a heart attack. Not exactly. More like a catastrophic arrhythmia. The kind that didn't give warnings. The kind that stole men quietly. "Call paramedics," Henry said sharply, his voice steady enough to cut through the rising panic. Several passengers jolted into action. Someone grabbed a phone. Someone else sprinted toward the nearest help desk. The man's wife pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. Is he dying?" "Not if we keep him here," Henry replied. His tone left no space for collapse. Not even hers. "Stay with me. He's still in this." She nodded rapidly, tears brimming. Henry leaned closer. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. He positioned his hands on the man's sternum. Compressions weren't his first choice, not until he confirmed arrest. But the man slipped further from consciousness with each passing second. His breathing had thinned to a thread. Behind them, airline staff rushed forward. Emily arrived first, eyes wide. "Oh my God, should I get an AED? Yes," Henry said without looking up. "Run!" She sprinted down the concourse, her footsteps echoing like frantic punctuation marks. Linda followed, moments later, her voice sharp and brittle. "What happened?" "He's in cardiac distress," Henry said. "Help clear space." Linda hesitated, not because she didn't want to help, but because shock froze her for a beat too long. Then she snapped out of it, pushing back the crowd, her commanding tone cutting through the noise. "Move aside. Give them room. Let security through." Henry lowered his ear toward the man's mouth, still breathing but shallow. Too shallow. His fingertips pressed gently along the man's jawline, checking for tension. Muscle spasms could signal hypoxia. Nothing yet. But time was leaking away from them both. The AED clattered to the floor as Emily returned, breathless. Henry flipped the case open with practiced ease. The clinical beeps, cold and metronomic, sliced through the terminal's hush. "Stay with me," Henry murmured, though the man couldn't hear him. His voice wasn't for the patient, it was for the room to anchor them all. He attached the pads, the machine analyzing. People held their breath as if silence could will the device to say the right words. "Shock advised," the AED announced. Henry exhaled low and grim. Clear. Even Linda stepped back instantly. Emily pressed her back against a pillar, eyes locked on the man's motionless chest. The shock jolted the man upward in a violent arc, then dropped him back to the cold tile. His wife cried out, but didn't interfere. Henry pressed 2 fingers against the carotid again. A pulse. Weak. Uneven. But a pulse. "Come on," Henry whispered. "Don't give up." The man's eyelids twitched. His head rolled slightly to one side, as if he were trying to find a way back into the world. Paramedics arrived at last, weaving through the crowd with their stretcher and medical packs. One of them, a tall woman with cropped hair and a steady gaze, knelt beside Henry. "We'll take it from here." But her eyes narrowed as she studied his technique. "You've done this before?" "Another lifetime," Henry said. The medic offered a short nod of respect. "Good work." They transitioned quickly, oxygen mask, vitals assessment, rolling the patient onto the stretcher. As they lifted him, the man's wife caught Henry's sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath quivering. "I thought I lost him." Henry placed a hand gently over hers. "He has a real chance now." She held his gaze for a long second, as if trying to understand something unspoken about the man who had saved her husband. But Henry stepped back, letting the paramedics wheel the stretcher away. The crowd began to disperse, but not fully. They didn't know what to make of him, this quiet man whose calm had overridden their fear. Some stared, some whispered, and some older faces, marked by decades of watching the world change too fast, looked at Henry with something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or respect reserved for people who acted when others froze. Linda approached cautiously. You handled that better than I've seen some of my own crew handle in-flight emergencies." Henry didn't answer immediately. He picked up his case, dusted off its corner, and straightened. "People do what they can," he said. "But you knew exactly what to do." He met her eyes. The overhead lights reflected the same tightness he wore earlier, but now it was shaped by something else, memory-old and heavy. "I did," he admitted quietly. "Once?" Emily stepped forward, still breathless, cheeks flushed with adrenaline. "Mr. Caldwell, I didn't know you." "You couldn't have," he said gently. "It's all right," a voice boomed from the overhead speakers, boarding for flight to London. "Delayed. Updated time pending." The terminal groaned collectively, but Henry didn't look frustrated. He wasn't thinking about London or missed meetings. His gaze drifted toward the path the paramedics had taken, as if part of him still followed them. Emily shifted awkwardly. "Do you need anything? Water a different seat when we get going again." Henry gave a small exhale, not a sigh, more like someone easing the tension from a wound that never fully healed. "No, I'll be fine." But Linda wasn't finished. "I misjudged you earlier," she said. The words came slowly, like she was forcing them through a doorway too narrow for pride. "I shouldn't have questioned your seat assignment the way I did. Not without checking the system properly." Henry's face remained unreadable, but his eyes softened by the smallest fraction. "Mistakes happen," he said. "It's a tough job. I've had a few myself." He began walking toward the waiting area. Emily watched him, chewing the inside of her cheek again. "He's not what I thought," she whispered. Linda didn't answer. She was staring at Henry with the wary eyes of someone who sensed there was more beneath the surface. Not just competence, not just resolve. Something weightier. Something that didn't belong to an ordinary traveler. Henry sat down in a corner seat, away from the crowd. He set the silver case at his feet, leaned back slightly, and let the ambient noise wash over him. But his mind didn't drift. It locked into the quiet, humming place where memory lived. Sirens wailing outside a trauma bay, a man bleeding out on a gurney, the faces of families he couldn't save, the weight that made him walk away from the ER for good. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. The terminal around him, blurred sounds, turning muffled distant. Then a shadow fell across him. He opened his eyes to find a man in a charcoal suit standing over him. Mid-40s, stern face, eyes that saw too much. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said, his voice low certain. "We need to talk." Henry straightened, expression unchanged, but heartbeat shifting its rhythm. "Who are you?" The man slipped a badge from his breast pocket. "Airport operations." But the insignia wasn't what caught Henry's attention. It was the subtle tremor in the man's voice when he said, "This isn't about what just happened out there. It's about something else, something we've been monitoring since early this morning." Henry's fingers curled slowly around the handle of his case. "What exactly have you been monitoring?" The man glanced around, lowering his voice. "A passenger on your flight. Someone who shouldn't be on the manifest, and someone who reacted the moment you stepped into that terminal." Henry frowned. "Reacted how?" The man's jaw tightened. "He tried to follow you." The terminal noise seemed to hush around them. Something heavy shifted in the air. Henry stood. "Show me." The man nodded once. "This way." Henry followed him into the corridor beyond, Gate C-22, unaware that the day's real turbulence had only begun, and the shadows he had tried to outrun for decades were finally catching up. Henry followed the man down the service corridor, the fluorescent lights above them flickering with an anxious pulse. The sounds of the terminal faded behind thick grey walls, replaced by the hollow echo of their footsteps. The man in the charcoal suit moved quickly, as if afraid something might catch up to them if he slowed. Henry matched his pace without effort, though a quiet tension coiled in his chest. He had walked hospital corridors that felt like tunnels between life and death. This one felt colder. They stopped at an unmarked security door. The man swiped his badge, waited for the click, and pushed it open. Inside was a small monitoring room, 2 desks, a rack of surveillance screens, and a humming computer tower that sounded like it was struggling to breathe in the stale air. A younger officer sat in front of the screens, fingers tapping nervously against a foam coffee cup. His knee bounced in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. When he looked up at Henry, his eyes widened slightly, not with recognition, but with something closer to fear. The man in the charcoal suit gestured for him to shift aside. "Show him," he said. The younger officer swallowed and toggled backward through camera feeds. "Gate C-22, angle 4, he murmured to himself. Timestamp right when the collapse happened. The screen showed the moment the man at the newsstand fell to the ground. Henry watched himself drop beside him, calm and controlled, like a man stepping back into a forgotten life. But the officer rewound a little further. "There," he said, pointing. Just before the collapse, a figure stood near the bookstore's entrance, half hidden by a rotating rack of travel pillows. He wore a faded denim jacket, hood up face, angled downward. Nothing unusual at first glance, but when Henry walked into frame sleeve, brushing against a row of magazines, the figure's posture changed. His head snapped up, his stance tensed, his fingers curled inside his pockets. Henry leaned forward slightly. "Freeze it." The image paused in a grainy still, a shadowed face. Hard to make out, but the angle of the jawline, the way the man held tension like a weapon, it sparked a flicker of something unwelcome in Henry's memory. "Continue," Henry said. The video resumed. As Henry moved toward the medical emergency, the hooded man slipped closer, threading through the edges of the crowd, careful to stay behind taller passengers. Not approaching exactly, but tracking. A predator's patience. Then a security officer stepped in front of him, blocking the view. The hooded man pivoted instantly and walked away, disappearing into the crush of travelers heading toward Terminal D. Henry exhaled through his nose, a slow, controlled release. "Did he get on a flight?" the younger officer clicked through departure logs. There was one boarding at the time, the non-stop to Nashville, but manifest verification wasn't completed because the gate was dealing with a medical call, meaning the older man muttered someone could have slipped through without being scanned. He turned toward Henry. "We've tightened our process, but this morning's glitch complicated everything." Henry's gaze drifted back to the still image. "Do you have another angle? Something closer?" The officer shook his head. Not of his face. But he hesitated, then pulled up a different camera feed. He left something behind. On the screen, the hooded man stopped near a trash bin. He reached into his jacket, removed a folded envelope, and tucked it behind the bin's frame before continuing on. It wasn't hidden well, as if he wanted someone specific to find it. Henry didn't speak, but the set of his jaw hardened. The older man retrieved a sealed evidence bag from the desk. Inside it, a white envelope lay slightly crumpled. The younger officer handed it to Henry with obvious reluctance, as though passing a fragile object capable of detonating. "We didn't open it," the officer said. "Chain of custody and all that." But given the way he was watching you, Henry took the envelope, turning it over in his hands. No markings, no writing. Just a faint indentation at the top corner, the pressure mark of someone gripping it too tightly. "Open it," the older man urged. Henry slid a thumb under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The room felt suddenly airless. On the paper, typed in a plain serif font, were 5 words. "You walked away." I didn't. Henry didn't move, didn't blink. A muscle ticked once, sharply near his right temple, a reaction too small for most observers, but unmistakable to anyone who knew how still he normally held himself. The older man frowned. "Does this mean something to you?" Henry folded the note with deliberate precision. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "That's not an answer," the man countered. Henry met his gaze, and the weight behind his eyes was colder than the dead air in the room. "If it were a threat to the airport, you would know. If it were a threat to your passengers, you would know. It's neither." The older man wasn't convinced. "Mr. Caldwell, we need clarity. That man followed you. He left this message. We have a responsibility, and I have mine," Henry said softly. "This ends with me." The finality in his tone shut down the conversation. Not by force, not by volume, but by the quiet authority of someone who'd made decisions far heavier than this one in rooms, colder than this one under lights, far harsher. The older man exhaled, defeated. "Then at least let us escort you. Put a detail on your gate. We can notify the airline reposition security." "Number," Henry placed the note back in the envelope. "All you'll do is spook him if he's still nearby. And if he is, I don't want him slipping out of reach again." Again, the younger officer asked. Henry didn't respond. The older man tried one last time. "At least tell us if you're in danger." Henry stood. If he wanted to harm me, today wouldn't have looked like this. He retrieved his silver case, turned toward the door, and paused only once, speaking without looking back. "Delete the footage from angle 4. Not the whole file. Just the segment where he's visible." Both officers stared at him, stunned. "We can't," the younger one began. "You can," Henry said, "and you will. There are reasons that man watched me instead of approaching, reasons that don't involve your jurisdiction." The older man lowered his voice. "Mr. Caldwell, what exactly are we dealing with?" Henry stepped into the corridor, his voice echoing gently off the concrete walls. "A ghost." He walked away before they could say more, But as he approached Gate C-22 again, a tension rippled underneath his calm. The envelope burned cold against his palm, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't say. He recognized the phrasing, he recognized the cadence, and he recognized the kind of mind that sent messages instead of speaking them. He had believed that chapter of his life sealed shut, buried, a thing left behind in the wreckage of long nights and colder decisions. But ghosts didn't stay dead just because a man chose to stop looking at them. When Henry re-entered the concourse, the crowd had settled into a restless murmur. People checked watches. Coffee lines grew. The man he had revived was long gone. The echo of that chaos replaced by the familiar discomfort of delayed travel. But Linda Barrett stood near the window, arms crossed her brows, knit in a deep, thoughtful line. She watched Henry return, and something in her expression flickered a reassessment, an uneasy curiosity. Emily approached him first. They updated the departure time. "We should board in about 20 minutes. She hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the corridor he'd emerged from. "Everything okay, Mr. Caldwell?" Henry offered the faintest smile. Everything is exactly as it should be. It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't dismissal. It was something else, an acknowledgement of an invisible fault line that had opened beneath the day's routine. Emily nodded slowly, though she didn't understand. Linda stepped closer, then lowering her voice. "You're not just a former medic, are you?" Henry met her eyes, the silver case hanging steady at his side. "No," he said. "I'm not." Before she could press further, a voice crackled over the speakers announcing pre-boarding. The day resumed its shape. But nothing inside Henry did. The jet bridge groaned as it connected to the aircraft, the metal trembling under each shift of weight. Passengers lined up with the familiar shuffle of resignation, clutching jackets, coffees, and half-finished conversations. Henry joined the flow without hurry, the silver case in his hand, tapping softly against his thigh like a muted heartbeat. He felt the envelope inside his coat pocket, with every step a small piece of paper heavier than steel. The interior of the aircraft greeted them with recycled air and dimmed lighting. The soft glow along the ceiling barely disguised the fatigue of the day's earlier flights. Henry stepped past the first row, where Linda stood, greeting passengers with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When he met her gaze, her smile faltered again, replaced by something more human. Gratitude, maybe, or fear of the unknown. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, quietly, nodding. "Welcome aboard." He returned the gesture, nothing more, and continued down the aisle. Emily followed behind him to assist another passenger, but her eyes drifted toward Henry, more than toward the boarding list she held in trembling fingers. Seat 7C waited for him, business class aisle. A temporary move while the system's earlier confusion cleared. The airline had insisted. Henry didn't argue. The seat didn't matter. What waited on this plane did. He slid into the seat and set the silver case gently beneath the one in front of him. The hum of boarding filled the cabin. Suitcases thunked into overhead bins. Voices murmured. A baby cried somewhere in row 10, a thin wail that cut through the air like a fragile thread. Henry closed his eyes. Only for a breath. "You walked away." "I didn't." The words resurfaced, sharp and relentless. He had walked away. He knew that. But the man behind the envelope, he should have disappeared years ago. Should have been gone long before Henry traded trauma wards for corporate boardrooms. Someone had covered that path with enough concrete and classified files to bury a lifetime. So why now? A heavy hand landed on the back of Henry's headrest. He opened his eyes as a man slid into the seat across the aisle. Mid-50s, thick mustache, oil-stained hands, work boots that looked like they'd survived 100 winters. The man exhaled sharply, dropping into the seat with a grunt. "Damn delays," he muttered. "Always happens when you gotta be somewhere." Henry offered a courteous nod. "Long day, long month," the man said. "Name's Frank. Henry." Frank wiped a sleeve across his forehead. "Never seen an airport shut down half its terminals for a medical scare. You see, that poor guy go down scared the hell out of folks." Henry said nothing. Frank didn't notice. He leaned in, lowering his voice. But there was something else. Right before it happened, security came tearing through the place like they were looking for someone. Henry's breath paused for a fraction of a second. Frank continued oblivious. Heard one of the guards say they'd spotted a suspicious character, hood up walking too close to folks. Probably just some idiot trying to cause trouble. Probably, Henry said, though his mind was already twisting the pieces together. Before Frank could say more, Linda's voice rose over the intercom, clipped but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, as soon as we complete our final security verification, we'll be ready for departure. Please remain seated. Final security verification." The phrase rolled through the cabin like a cold wind. It was unusual, not unheard of, but enough to put nerves on edge. Across the aisle, Frank frowned. Security again. "What the hell's going on today?" Henry shifted slightly, angling toward the window. His reflection stared back, calm, composed, the face he'd practiced for years. But behind that reflection loomed the shadow of the hooded man, the shadow with a familiar jawline, the shadow who had left a message meant only for him. "You walked away." "I didn't." A figure moved up the aisle, interrupting his thoughts. A tall passenger in an army green jacket, broad shoulders, clean-cut hair, a clipped stride that suggested training, not habit. He paused 3 rows ahead to stow his duffel bag overhead, his movements efficient. Frank straightened. "Military guy," he muttered. "Bet he's going to fall asleep before the wheels even lift." But Henry saw something else. Not the uniform, there was none. Not the build, but the eyes. Sharp, constantly scanning. The kind of scanning a man did when he wasn't just watching the world, but checking for someone inside it. Henry narrowed his gaze. The soldier-like man caught the glance, held it for half a second too long, then looked away. Not hostile, not afraid. Assessing. A memory flickered behind Henry's eyes. A hallway, a metal table, the low hum of a fluorescent light that never quite worked. A man sitting across from him, hands trembling after a failed resuscitation. A voice saying, "You can't save everyone." Caldwell followed by another voice, whispering, "But some people don't forget who didn't save them." Frank leaned closer. "You know him, no," Henry said. But it wasn't entirely true. The boarding door closed with a decisive thud. Cabin pressure shifted as Linda made her way down the aisle for the final check. When she reached Henry's row, she stopped briefly, her voice, low enough only he could hear. "If you need anything before takeoff," she said, "just press the call button. I'll handle it personally." It was not an offer. It was a promise. He nodded once. She moved on. Engines whirred to life beneath them, low at first, then rising into a steady roar. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled. A few clutched armrests. A few whispered prayers. Others opened magazines they had no intention of reading. The plane pushed back from the gate. Frank sighed. Finally. "Let's get this bird in the air." Henry watched the soldier-like man 3 rows up. The man didn't watch the window like the others. He didn't relax. He simply sat upright, shoulders, square hands, clasped breathing slow. Waiting. Henry felt it. Then the shift. The quiet before a pressure drop. The sensation of an old, invisible thread being pulled taut from somewhere deep in the past. As the plane lined up on the runway lights, flickering outside like stars smeared across metal, Henry's fingers brushed the envelope inside his coat again. You walked away. I didn't. The engines thundered. The plane surged forward. And as the wheels left the ground, the man in the army green jacket finally turned. Not toward the window, not toward the attendant, toward Henry. Their eyes locked, unblinking, unhidden. And Henry understood the truth instantly, like a blade pushed gently between the ribs. The man wasn't following him. He was guarding him. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, a long, steady vibration settling through the floorboards like a quiet warning. Seatbelt signs dimmed. Overhead bins creaked as the cabin adjusted to the shift in pressure. Conversations began to sprout in small, uneven pockets, whispers, nervous laughs, the rustle of snack wrappers. But none of it touched the tension stretching between Henry and the man in the army green jacket. Henry didn't look away. Neither did the stranger. For a few seconds, the world around them blurred the hum of turbines, fading into a low, distant tremor. Then the man offered the smallest nod, deliberate, controlled, and turned forward again, as if acknowledging a truth neither of them wanted, spoken aloud. Frank across the aisle cracked open a ginger ale. "Man's got the posture of a Marine," he muttered. "Bet he's seen some things." Henry didn't answer. His focus held on the subtle details, the man's shoulders never easing the faint scar near his temple, the calloused hands resting palm down on his thighs. He wasn't guarding out of loyalty. He was guarding because he expected something to happen, and because he wasn't sure where it would come from. A flight attendant's cart clattered softly down the aisle. Emily pushed it, her smile polite but strained. She served the rows ahead with practiced warmth, though her eyes kept flitting toward Henry, as if pulled by a force she didn't fully understand. When she reached his row, she paused. "Something to drink, Mr. Caldwell water," he said. She poured it carefully, then lowered her voice. "Is everything all right?" Henry studied her face, young, earnest, already bruised by the weight of responsibility she wasn't trained to carry. "You handled yourself well earlier," he said. "That kind of calm isn't easy under pressure." Emily blinked, startled. Then pride softened her expression. "I just wanted to do the right thing." "That's harder than you think." Before she could respond, Linda's voice crackled through the intercom tense, as if suppressing something she didn't want passengers to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you see anything unusual in the cabin, please notify the crew immediately. We're asking for your cooperation." Emily stiffened. She never says that unless something's wrong. Henry set his glass down. "Go check on her." Emily hurried away, her shoes tapping quickly on the carpet. Frank watched her go, frowning. "You think something's up?" Feels like the air got colder the second she talked. Henry didn't reply. He'd already noticed it. 3 rows ahead, the man in the army green jacket had straightened again, eyes sweeping the length of the cabin in a slow, methodical scan. A soldier's scan. A hunter's scan. Then he rose. Smooth, silent, controlled, he reached for the overhead bin, but instead of rummaging, he palmed something small from inside his jacket, metal glinting quick as a flicker of flame, and slipped it into the storage compartment above row 9. Then he stepped back into his seat, face expressionless. Frank didn't see it. Passengers didn't see it. Henry saw everything. His pulse steadied, not with fear, with clarity, a different kind of crisis, one he hadn't tasted in years. He unbuckled his seatbelt. Frank blinked. "Where are you going?" "Washroom," Henry said, stretching my legs. Frank nodded slowly, but uncertainly. "All right. But hurry. Turbulence always finds me when I least want it." Henry stepped into the aisle. The moment he rose, the man in the green jacket's gaze flicked up, brief but unmistakable. An acknowledgement. Almost a question. Not yet, Henry thought. He moved past Linda, who was speaking with a co-pilot near the galley curtain. Her voice was a strained whisper. "I don't care what the manifest says something's off. I can feel it. Just keep cockpit protocol tight." The co-pilot murmured something back, too low for Henry to hear. He continued down the aisle, heart-steady mind sharpening into the cold precision he'd tried to bury years ago. At row 9 he slowed, not enough to draw attention, just enough to glance upward. The overhead bin's latch wasn't fully closed, a tiny gap between metal and plastic, the kind left when something inside had been placed with haste. Henry glanced at the soldier-like man again. The man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't deny it. He was watching to see whether Henry would open it. Not prey, not predator. Observer. Henry kept walking, slipping into the shadow of the rear galley. The crew curtains rustled faintly as the plane cut through a pocket of thin air. No one followed him. No one noticed him. It was the strange invisibility he had mastered long before he ever stepped into a corporate tower. He stopped at the far end of the cabin where a small convex mirror gave him a sweeping view of the aisle. The man in the green jacket remained seated. Frank sipped his soda. Passengers scrolled phones, slept or complained under their breath. Normal. Deceptively normal. Henry reached inside his coat and pulled out the envelope. He unfolded the paper again. "You walked away?" "I didn't." The words stared back, stark and cold. Then he flipped the page over. The back wasn't blank. There was a number printed in small, neat type. 1241. Not a phone number. A time. Henry froze. He wasn't thinking of the plane. He wasn't thinking of the terminal. He wasn't thinking of the man in the green jacket. He was thinking of the night 12 years ago, when he stood outside a hospital storeroom at 12:41 in the morning, realizing he had made a choice that couldn't be undone. A choice that left a man abandoned. A man who shouldn't have survived. A man who would want him to see this message now. Henry closed the note slowly, fighting the tightening in his chest. Behind him, the rear lavatory door clicked. Emily stepped out, wiping her hands nervously. She nearly collided with him. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell. Sorry. I didn't see you." "It's all right," he said. She lingered, studying him again, as if sensing the tension radiating off him. "Linda said we may have extra security checks when we land in London. Something about a flagged bag." Henry didn't answer, because he already knew the truth. Something had been placed on this aircraft. Something meant for him. And the man who planted it wasn't the threat. He was the warning. Emily's voice softened. "Are you sure you're okay?" Henry met her eyes, letting the mask drop for just a moment, enough for her to see the gravity beneath. "No," he said quietly. "But I will be." A turbulence jolt shook the cabin, suddenly a sharp dip that rattled service trays and snapped seatbelt buckles. Passengers gasped. The lights flickered. Henry steadied himself against the galley wall. When the plane evened out, he didn't return to his seat. He headed toward row 9, toward the overhead bin, toward the thing waiting inside it. But before he reached it, A voice murmured behind him, low and firm. "Don't." Henry turned. The man in the army green jacket stood in the aisle, blocking the way, eyes locked on Henry's, with unnerving clarity. "It's not time," the man said, "and you're not the only one he's after." Henry didn't move. Neither did the man blocking the narrow aisle. The steady drone of the engines filled the silence between them, a low metallic hum vibrating through the floorboards and up Henry's spine. Passengers nearby sensed something subtle shift in the air, though they couldn't name it. A woman in row 8 stopped flipping her magazine. A teenager lowered his headphones. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. "What do you mean he's not only after me?" Henry asked. The man didn't answer right away. His gaze kept sweeping the cabin, methodical, attentive, tracing each movement from row to row, like he was measuring threat vectors. Only when the aisle cleared behind him did he shift his focus back to Henry. "Walk with me," he said. Henry hesitated. Not out of fear, but calculation. Trust was currency, and this man hadn't earned $1 of it. Yet the precision in his movements, the measured cadence of his voice, the faint scar near his temple, they weren't random. They belonged to someone trained to survive places far harsher than a commercial cabin at 35,000 feet. Henry stepped aside. The man moved toward the rear galley, letting Henry follow by half a step. They stopped just before the curtain that separated the lavatories from the rest of the cabin. The engines vibrated through the thin wall, turning the air into a dull, rhythmic tremor. "My name is Mason Hart," the man said quietly. "I'm here because I was sent to keep eyes on you." Henry's jaw tightened. Sent by whom? Someone who knew this wouldn't stay buried forever. "I don't deal in riddles," Henry replied. "You want something from me? Say it plain." Mason leaned his shoulder against the wall, positioning himself so no passenger could overhear. 12:41 in the morning. "That wasn't the last time he saw you." Henry's breath stilled. Mason continued, voice low and steady. "He tracked you. For years. Not because you walked away. Because he believes you're the only person still alive who could reveal what happened that night." "He's wrong," Henry said, though the assertion rang hollow even to him. "Maybe. But he doesn't think so. And men like him don't stop when they're convinced the world owes them a reckoning." Henry studied Mason's expression. Calm, controlled, deadly in stillness. But beneath that control lived something else. Fatigue, guilt, or a personal stake he was trying hard to hide. "You knew him," Henry said. Mason didn't deny it. A beat passed. The plane shuddered through a pocket of rough air, rattling the overhead bins. Mason pushed off the wall and stepped closer to Henry. "He wasn't supposed to be on this flight," Mason said. "His name's not on any list. But he boarded through Terminal D, slipped through the transfer flow, and got into the service corridor before anyone noticed. And the object in that overhead bin, it's not a bomb," Mason said. "Not a weapon. Not the way you're thinking. Then what is it? A marker. For what? For the next move he wants you to make." Henry exhaled sharply, frustration cracking through the calm exterior he wore like armor. Why, he asked. "After all these years, why drag this back up? Now I left that world to protect people, not endanger them." Mason's eyes softened, not with sympathy but recognition. "You don't get to walk away clean, Caldwell. Not from that night. Not from him. You knew it then, even if you pretended otherwise." Before Henry could respond, Linda swept towards them, her tension radiating like heat. "Gentlemen," she hissed, "I need you both in your seats. We're expecting light turbulence, and we have to maintain aisle clearance." Her eyes darted between them, searching for clues she couldn't articulate. "Is everything all right here?" Mason answered before Henry could. "We're fine." Linda didn't buy it. Her gaze lingered on Henry, then on the overhead bins near row 9. "If there's something happening on this plane," she said, voice low, "I need to know. I've flown 30 years. I can tell when danger's creeping on board." Henry met her stare. "We're handling it. I'm not reassured," Linda shot back. Mason stepped forward, his posture softening just enough to appear non-threatening. "Ma'am," he said, "if you intervene at the wrong moment, you could make things worse." "Worse than not knowing," she countered. Henry touched her arm gently, an anchor of calm against her rising fear. "You'll be the first to know when it's time," he said. Linda frowned, but something in Henry's voice, its steadiness, its certainty, settled her just enough. "Fine. But I'm watching both of you." She turned sharply and strode away. When she was out of earshot, Mason lowered his voice again. "You should open the bin. You told me not to, because doing it in front of passengers would cause panic." He paused. "Open it now." Quietly. Henry stepped toward row 9. Mason shadowing him like an echo. The aisle was momentarily empty. A perfect window. Henry reached up, popped the latch, and lifted the overhead bin an inch, just enough to see inside. A small metal box sat on top of a worn denim bag. Plain. Scratched. No markings except a single line etched along the top, "Return what you owe." Henry felt the floor tilt under him, the steady hum of the aircraft thinning into a ghostly whine. He closed the bin quickly, fingers trembling for the first time since the morning. Mason watched him closely. "You know what that means." Henry shook his head slowly. "No." He couldn't have known. "Not this," Caldwell Mason said, voice dropping into something hard and unforgiving. "You may have buried that night, but he didn't. He carried it. Every year. Every hour. And now he wants you to carry your part again." Henry stepped back, struggling to contain the surge rising through him. Memories he'd locked away began clawing up the walls he'd built around them. The blood, the shouting, the sound of metal hitting concrete, the moment he realized he'd chosen one life over another. "Why bring you into this?" Henry asked. "Because I was there too," Mason said. "Because I made a different choice, and because he thinks you ruined everything." A chill crawled up Henry's spine. "You think he's on this plane?" "I know he is," Mason said. "And he's waiting for a chance you haven't given him yet." Henry felt the envelope against his chest again, burning colder now, the words echoing through him like a death sentence carved in ice. "You walked away." "I didn't." Henry straightened. His voice, when it finally came, was a whisper carved from steel. "Then we find him." Mason nodded. "We already have a lead." "What lead?" Mason tilted his head toward the front of the cabin. Henry followed the motion and froze. 2 rows ahead, beside the curtain to first class, a man in a worn denim jacket stood with his back turned, adjusting something under his sleeve. The very jacket from the surveillance feed. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was positioning himself, waiting. Henry's pulse steadied into a slow, dangerous rhythm. Everything he had tried to abandon was suddenly alive again. And the man he had failed all those years ago was no longer a ghost. He was walking toward the cockpit. He moved with the casual sway of any passenger stretching their legs, but Henry saw the truth in the posture. The denim-jacketed man wasn't wandering. He was advancing step by steady step toward the forward galley, where only a thin curtain and a coded door separated the cabin from the cockpit. The faint tremor in the man's right hand wasn't nerves. It was anticipation. a readiness coiled too tight to be anything else. Mason caught Henry's eye. No words, just intent. He edged forward, staying 2 passengers behind the man, keeping enough distance not to trigger suspicion, but closing the gap 1 quiet inch at a time. Henry followed, heart-steady, breath measured. He had learned long ago that fear wasn't loud. Fear crept in silence, pulse tucked beneath the ribs. The aisle narrowed as he approached the ceiling lights, flickering with each step like failing street lamps in an alley he'd once tried to forget. The denim-jacketed man paused at row 3. A flight attendant stood there. Not Linda, but a younger woman with auburn hair, pulled into a tight bun. Her hands were wrapped around a tray of empty glasses, her polite smile wobbling at the edges. "Sir," she said softly, "the lavatory line starts behind business class. You can return to your seat," while he ignored her. His fingers brushed the curtain. Henry felt the shift before it happened, the minuscule drop in the man's shoulders. The inhale sharpened to a point. The weight shifted subtly to the balls of his feet. A man preparing to push through. Henry lunged. Not reckless, not desperate, controlled. A surgeon's precision wrapped in an ER medic's reflexes. He grabbed the man's forearm just as the stranger slipped his hand beneath the jacket, closing over a small cylindrical object tucked into an inside pocket. Not a weapon. Not a detonator. Something stranger. Something lighter. The man jerked backward, snarling under his breath, his eyes dark, bloodshot, pulsing with something feral locked onto Henry's. Recognition flared. "You," the man hissed. In that single syllable lived 12 years of bitterness. The tray of glasses clattered to the floor behind them. Mason shoved through passengers to reach them, his voice low, commanding. "Don't move." But the denim-jacketed man twisted with surprising strength. He tore his arm free and stumbled backward, knocking into seat 2B. A startled businessman dropped his newspaper, stammering a confused protest. The man shoved past him and lunged for the curtain again. Henry blocked him, bracing his shoulder against the aisle divider. "You're not going through." The man laughed, a broken, breathless sound. "You think I'm here to hurt the pilot, after what you took from me? No. No, Caldwell. I'm here for the truth you buried." Passengers began rising alarmed murmurs, swelling like a slow-forming storm. The auburn-haired attendant pressed her hand to her earpiece, voice trembling. "Linda, we need you now. Something's wrong up front." Linda pushed through the curtain seconds later, her face drained of color at the sight unfolding a man trembling with fury, Henry blocking him, Mason closing in from behind. "What is happening?" she demanded. The denim-jacketed man's gaze snapped toward her, sharp, calculating. He seized the small metal cylinder from his pocket and held it up. Gasps rippled through the front rows. Someone whimpered. A businessman ducked instinctively, pulling his wife close. Linda's breath hitched. "Sir, put that down." "Whatever it is, it's not what you think," he snarled, brandishing it like a threat. "This isn't about you, or this plane. It's about him." Henry stepped forward. "Let them go. Talk to me instead. You don't get to ask for that." The man spat. Not after 12:41 in the morning. Passengers stiffened. Mothers reached for children. The hum of the engines grew louder, or maybe fear sharpened every sound into a blade. Henry raised both hands, slowly, palms open. "If you want the story told, tell it. Right here, right now. You don't need leverage. You don't need props." The man's chest heaved. A tremor traveled through his fingers. "You let him die," he whispered, voice cracking. "And you walked out like it was another shift." "But it wasn't for me." Henry's jaw locked. "I didn't walk out. You left," the man shouted. The first scream came from row 2, then another from row 5. Cabin panic rising, oxygen turning metallic in the air. Mason stepped in. Easy, easy. No one's hurt. Put that thing down before TSA meets us on the runway with rifles. You don't want that. The man looked between Mason and Henry, breath ragged. The cylinder trembled. They covered it up. They buried the report, said it was unavoidable. But he chose me. He wanted me saved. Not Henry cut him off, voice low, almost gentle. Your brother was bleeding internally. You both were. 1 stabilizer pack, 2 patients, 1 choice. I took the one with a pulse that hadn't slipped away yet. The man flinched as if struck. Passengers fell silent. Even the engine seemed to fade. You said he had a chance, the man whispered. I heard you. You said he had a chance. Henry closed his eyes briefly, not in regret, but in memory. He did. For 3 minutes. And then he didn't. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. The man staggered backward, hitting the bulkhead. His grip loosened. The cylinder slipped from his fingers, rolling harmlessly across the aisle until it bumped into Mason's boot. It wasn't a detonator. It was a hospital inhaler. Old, scuffed, unused. The man sank into seat 1C, trembling as the weight of 12 years crashed through him. Tears welled, not loud, not dramatic, just exhausted. Linda's voice softened. So we can talk about this. Let us help you. He shook his head. Help. They never helped him. They just told me he died alone, while Caldwell walked away. Henry knelt, slow, deliberate, until he and the man were at eye level. He didn't die alone, he said. I was there until the moment he passed. I held the stabilizer against his chest until my hands shook. I didn't walk away. The man blinked. Confusion washed through him like a cold tide. They told me they lied, Mason murmured, stepping beside Henry. All of us were told what we needed to keep moving. But Caldwell stayed. He didn't leave that room. The man's breathing stuttered. Then why the note? You wanted someone to blame, Henry said softly. And I was the one holding your brother when he slipped away. Silence swallowed the front of the cabin. A child sniffed. A woman whispered a prayer under her breath. Linda exhaled a shaky breath. We need to get him seated. And we need to notify the captain. The man looked up at Henry again, eyes hollowed by grief confusion and a decade of wrong conclusions. I waited 12 years to confront a ghost, he whispered. But you weren't the one who killed him. Henry placed a steady hand on his shoulder. No, I tried to keep him alive. And I've carried that night as long as you have. The man broke shoulders, slumping, as if an invisible weight finally dropped from his spine. Mason signaled subtly for Linda to step back. Henry glanced at the metal cylinder near Mason's foot. He wasn't here to hurt anyone, Henry said quietly. He was here to be heard. Linda nodded, voice unsteady. I believe you. The plane hit a mild pocket of turbulence, then rocking gently. But for the first time since takeoff, the cabin didn't panic. Eyes shifted, but not with fear. With understanding. Henry rose slowly. Let's sit him somewhere calm, he said, away from the aisle. The man let Henry guide him, exhausted, spent, hollow. As he slid into seat 1C again, he whispered, I thought you abandoned him. Henry shook his head. Never. And the promise he made me keep Henry's expression tightened a ripple of tension, moving beneath the calm. We'll talk about that too. Mason stepped beside him, voice low. We're not done up here. Henry nodded once. No, he murmured. We're not. Because someone else had fed this man a lie. Someone who wanted Henry drawn out. Someone who wasn't on this plane by accident. Henry felt the tension shift in the cabin, the way a physician feels a pulse change under his fingertips. The denim-jacketed man had quieted, but quiet wasn't safety. Quiet meant something had settled, only long enough for something else to rise. Mason stayed planted near the bulkhead, intercepting curious glances and murmured questions, keeping the front rows from erupting again. Linda crouched beside the distressed man, in one sea speaking softly, her voice steadier, now that she understood the threat had never been explosive. It had been emotional, raw, misdirected. But Henry was no longer focused on the man in the denim jacket. He was replaying every word, every tremor, every fractured piece of the truth that had surfaced too easily. Someone told him a lie. Someone told him what to believe. Someone told him to find me. Henry stood the floor, humming beneath his shoes. Mason caught the movement instantly. "Where are you going?" he asked quietly. "To find the one pulling the strings." Mason's jaw tightened. "We can't start hunting shapes in the dark." "We're not hunting," Henry replied. "We're confirming." He moved down the aisle before Mason could argue. People watched him with the wide, unsettled stare. Passengers always give in the aftermath of a scare. But Henry's pace was calm, unhurried, a steady rhythm that disguised the storm building inside him. He stopped near row 12, the midpoint of the aircraft where sound softened and people assumed anonymity. Two passengers argued in low voices about a missed connection. A woman scrolled through her phone, pretending not to stare at Henry. A teenage boy looked up from a handheld game, eyes bright with curiosity. Henry scanned the row numbers, the overhead bins, the angles of faces pretending not to notice him. And then he saw it a subtle imprint on seat 14A's armrest. A thumb smudge, fresh. Grease darkened. Whoever sat there earlier had worked with engines, machinery, or old tools. It could have been anyone. But the smudge was too close to the overhead vent, positioned exactly where a person might brace themselves while slipping something into the slot behind the oxygen mask panel. Henry leaned forward, examining the seam. Nothing visible. But he didn't need visible. He needed pattern. The same pattern as the metal container found in row 9. He whispered under his breath. Someone wanted more than a confrontation. A voice behind him replied, low and calm. Someone wanted you to feel unsteady. Henry didn't turn. Mason, if you're going to shadow me, at least try not to breathe directly into my thoughts. Mason stepped beside him, eyes scanning the cabin. 14. A boarded early. He sat alone. He asked for a blanket before the cabin door even closed. You have a manifest list. I watched the boarding flow, Mason said. It's a habit I don't know how to break. Henry nodded slowly. Who was he? Didn't get a look at his face. Cap pulled low beard sunglasses. He kept to himself. Never spoke. Where is he now? That's the problem, Mason replied. He isn't. A quiet crack of realization moved through Henry. You're saying he disappeared after takeoff, not disappeared, moved. Mason's eyes swept the cabin again. People don't go missing in aluminum tubes unless they want to be found somewhere else. Henry pictured the plane as an anatomy diagram, aisles, like arteries, galleys, like organs, storage compartments, like hidden cavities. A man could shift from seat to lavatory, from lavatory to galley, from galley to bulkhead. Passengers switch seats all the time. Crew rarely question it, unless they are trained to search for ghosts. Henry's gaze drifted to the back of the plane. The rear lavatory light was on, had been on for too long. A mild jolt of turbulence rocked the cabin. The seatbelt signs blinked to life, dinging overhead like impatient bells. Linda's voice emerged from the speaker system, steady but coated with concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats promptly. Flight crew prepare for temporary turbulence." Passengers shuffled. Some complained, others grabbed armrests. But Henry moved toward the rear lavatory despite the sign. Mason followed, whispering, "If someone is inside, he'll hear us approach. He already knows we're coming," Henry replied. They reached the lavatory door. Henry knocked twice, sharp, deliberate. Silence answered. Mason's voice dropped to a whisper. On 3, Henry didn't answer. He simply twisted the handle, unlocked. The door swung inward. Empty, but not untouched. The mirror behind the sink was fogged, even though the air was cool. Written across the glass, faint but unmistakable, were 4 words drawn with a fingertip: "You weren't alone." Henry's breath stilled. Not the way a frightened man freezes, the way a man buries something deeper. Mason stepped in, scanning. No footprints on the metal floor, no scent of cologne, sweat, or fear. The lavatory was cold. Too cold. As if whoever had been there left moments before, slipping into the crew area during turbulence, when eyes turned inward and heads dipped. Mason wiped the message with a paper towel. "He's taunting you. He's reminding me," Henry said. Of what Henry didn't look at him. Of the choice I made that night. The choice he thinks I made alone. Mason's expression stiffened. There was nothing else you could have done. That's not how he sees it. Henry stepped out of the lavatory, and not how someone else sees it either. They moved back toward the aisle. The turbulence deepened the plane, shuddering hard enough to rattle overhead bins. Gasps scattered through the cabin. A coffee cup toppled onto a passenger's lap. The engines groaned, adjusting. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. A few passengers screamed softly, but Henry's eyes snapped upward. Flickering light wasn't unusual, but flickering combined with turbulence, combined with the messages, combined with the planted object in row 9, that wasn't weather. That wasn't coincidence. That was timing. Calculated timing. Mason leaned close. "You think he's trying to push you toward something?" "No," Henry said. "He's clearing away distractions." For what Henry looked toward the cockpit. For the person who actually wants me dead. Before Mason could respond, the PA system crackled violently. A burst of static hissed through the speakers so loud some passengers clapped hands to their ears. Then a voice bled through. Not the captain's, not the co-pilot's. A voice low, distorted, but unmistakably deliberate. "Caldwell." Henry froze. All of row 12 froze with him. The voice continued slow and calm, the way a man speaks when he knows exactly how deep the knife is going in. 12:41 in the morning wasn't the night your story ended. The cabin fell into absolute silence. It was the night mine began. Static swallowed the voice. The intercom clicked off. Linda's panicked whisper followed, rising through the quiet like a trembling thread. "Captain, we didn't send that." How Henry stepped forward, but Mason grabbed his arm. "Don't rush. He wants you to react." "He already knows I will," Henry said, shaking him off. The turbulence steadied as abruptly as it had begun. The lights returned to full brightness. The engines hummed with unnatural calm. Passengers murmured again, unsure whether to panic or pretend nothing had happened. Mason moved to Henry's side. "He has access to the comm system. That's only possible from 2 places." Henry nodded, jaw tightening. "The cockpit," he said. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Or the forward crew panel." Henry turned his gaze toward the front of the plane, his expression hardening with a slow, dangerous certainty. "He's not behind us anymore," Henry said. Mason shook his head. "No, he's ahead." Henry took a step forward, then another, and another. Every shadow in the cabin suddenly felt too deep, every passenger too still, every second too loud. The hunter was no longer the man they confronted. It was the man waiting for them at the front of the aircraft, the one who knew Henry Caldwell better than anyone alive. The aisle felt narrower than before, as if the aircraft itself sensed what waited at the front and tightened around Henry's steps. He moved with purpose but not haste. Speed invited panic, and panic clouded judgment. Mason shadowed him in silence, muscles coiled beneath his jacket. The forward cabin lights glowed too softly, a dim wash across rows of uneasy faces. Every passenger seemed to sense a pressure shift, though none could name it. Henry reached row 6 when Linda stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. Her lips were pressed into a tight line, but her eyes trembled with something close to fear. "You heard that voice?" she whispered. "Who was that? How did someone tap into the cockpit system?" Henry lowered his voice. "Where's the captain?" "In the cockpit," Linda said. "They're trying to diagnose the interference." "But Henry..." She swallowed hard. "The first officer thinks someone may have accessed the secondary panel." "The forward maintenance panel?" Mason asked. Linda nodded. "We locked it before takeoff. I checked it myself." Henry met Mason's gaze. "Then someone with clearance unlocked it after we were airborne." Linda stiffened. "We don't give clearance to passengers," Mason answered for Henry, "unless the person wasn't meant to be a passenger." Linda stepped back, shaken. "Do you want me to alert ground security?" "No," Henry said. "Not yet. We control this quietly, or we risk a cabin panic. But if someone's planning to destabilize the plane, he's not," Henry cut in gently but firmly. "If he wanted that, he wouldn't be talking to me. He'd be acting." Linda stared at him, searching for reassurance. She found none, only certainty. Finally, she stepped aside, but not before saying, "If this goes wrong, we lose more than control." Henry nodded. "It won't go wrong," Mason murmured under his breath. "Optimistic." "Accurate," Henry replied. They continued forward. The curtain to first class swayed gently. From turbulence long past, voices filtered through anxious whispers, the strained patience of premium passengers, unused to mystery. Henry pushed the curtain aside. First class was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people pretend to relax, but brace their bodies for impact. A man in a grey suit clutched a half-empty wine glass, staring fixedly at the emergency card in his seat pocket. An older woman whispered a prayer into her palm. A young professional removed an earbud and followed Henry with wary eyes, sensing the authority in his steps, even if she didn't know why. But one seat stood out empty. The seat assigned to 14A's vanished passenger. Henry leaned slightly toward Mason. He didn't hide among economy passengers. "No," Mason said. "He came here." The forward galley door was cracked open. A thin strip of fluorescent light bled onto the carpet, its pale glow stretching toward Henry's shoes like a warning. He raised his hand. Mason nodded once. Henry nudged the galley door open with the back of his knuckles. Inside, a man sat on the metal jump seat, elbows on his knees, hands hanging loose between them. He wore a Navy maintenance jacket, crew issued. His hair was cut short, his jaw shadowed, his posture relaxed in a way that wasn't natural, relaxed like a coiled spring before release. He didn't look up. Not at first. Only when the door latched shut behind Henry and Mason did he lift his gaze. And when he did, the air changed. These weren't the eyes of the grieving, denim-jacketed man. These were the eyes of someone who had survived long enough to learn how to weaponize grief. "Caldwell," he said, voice even articulate. "You made better time than I expected." Mason stiffened. "You accessed a restricted system. That's a federal offense." The man ignored him completely. "I knew you'd come when you heard my voice. You always did follow threads too quickly." Henry stepped forward, each movement measured. "You've been speaking through other people, leaving messages, stirring grief that didn't belong to you. Didn't belong to me." The man chuckled without mirth. "Everything on that night belonged to all of us." Henry's throat tightened. There it was, not accusation, not blame. Claim. "What do you want?" Henry asked. The man lifted a small black device from his lap. Mason lunged instinctively, but Henry raised a hand, stopping him. The device wasn't an explosive. It wasn't a weapon. It was a cockpit interphone side unit, unplugged from somewhere inside the forward panel. "You used this to transmit," Henry said. "I did," the man replied. "And don't worry. I didn't touch a single operational control. I respect pilots too much for that. They do what I never could. They save people." The words dug under Henry's skin, sharp as glass. "Who are you?" Henry asked, though part of him already knew. The man tilted his head, studying him. "We never met. Not directly. But I knew your voice. I heard it through the curtain while you fought to save him, while you tried to choose which life had more time left." Henry closed his eyes briefly. The man continued. "You couldn't save my father, Caldwell." Henry opened his eyes. The stranger's gaze hardened. "No one told my brother the truth because they thought he couldn't handle it. But I knew. I was 19. Old enough to understand that sometimes the world decides who dies on cold floors under fluorescent lights." Mason inhaled slowly. "Your father, he was the third patient." The man nodded. "The one no one talks about. The one whose chart vanished in the system the same night Caldwell left the ER for good." Henry felt his pulse shift. "Your father wasn't savable. He had no vitals when we found him. That's what they wrote," the man said. "But I've learned that paperwork bends when people in power want to sleep at night." Henry stepped closer. "Are you here for revenge?" The man's lips curved into a small, strange smile. "No. I'm here for truth. The truth you've been running from since 12:41 in the morning." Mason moved subtly between them, positioning himself at an angle that offered both protection and confrontation. "You put the passengers on this plane at risk for closure." The man's expression flickered offended. "No one here was ever in danger. You misunderstand me. I didn't come here to take something. I came here to show Caldwell what he left behind." He reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. He held it out to Henry. Henry hesitated before taking it. He unfolded the page, a hospital incident report, but not one he recognized. The lines blurred under the dim galley light, but 3 details shone with chilling clarity. The time, 12:41 in the morning. The room, Trauma Bay 2. The note scrawled at the bottom, "Family notified older son present." Henry felt the air thin. "Someone altered this." "Yes," the man said softly, "and they altered it to make you walk away from the profession that could have saved hundreds more." Mason's voice lowered into a growl. "Why would anyone do that?" The man leaned back, exhaling. "To recruit him." Henry's blood ran cold. What Mason whispered. The man looked at Henry with a quiet, devastating certainty. "You were meant for something else. Someone else. Someone higher. Someone who needed you broken so you could be rebuilt." The aircraft hummed steadily around them, eerie in its calm. Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. "Who?" The man held his gaze. "The same person who sent me." Mason stiffened. Henry's heart clenched. "And who is that?" Henry asked. The man smiled faintly. "The person you swore never to face again." Before Henry could speak, the intercom crackled sharply, and the captain's voice cut through the cabin. "Mr. Caldwell, please report to the cockpit immediately." The man's smile deepened. "He's waiting for you." The plane flew on steady, as if nothing were unfolding inside it. But everything Henry Caldwell had buried was rising, and the next door he opened would lead straight into the past he'd spent half a lifetime escaping. Henry felt the weight of the captain's summons settle over him like a sheet of cold iron. The stranger in the maintenance jacket did not move to stop him. He only watched with the calm of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Mason hovered close, his jaw tight, his posture ready for anything. But Henry stepped past both men without hesitation, his footsteps slow-steady, the kind of measured stride a man uses when walking toward the truth he can no longer outrun. The forward galley lights flickered as he approached the cockpit door. The faint hum of avionics leaked through the metal, a pulse of hidden machinery and steady calculations. Linda stood to the side with her hands clasped together, eyes wide with fear she tried to swallow. Henry gave her a small nod. Not reassurance, permission. She pulled in a shaky breath and stepped aside. The door clicked open from inside. The captain, a man in his early 60s with weathered eyes and the stoic posture of 3 decades in the sky, looked at Henry with an expression that was neither welcome nor warning. It was something stranger, recognition, perhaps, or dread borrowed from someone else. The first officer sat rigidly in his seat, knuckles white on his checklist. "Mr. Caldwell," the captain said, "we received an encrypted transmission routed through our internal comm relay. It was addressed to you personally." Henry stepped into the cockpit, the door sealing behind him, with a mechanical click that felt like a lock closing on an old vault. The narrow space smelled of metal coffee and cold oxygen. Screens glowed with navigation data. The horizon line stretched smooth and level across the glass. "What did the message say?" Henry asked. The captain didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid a small audio device across the console. We didn't record it, but we transcribed the last line. Henry unfolded the slip of paper. 5 words stared back at him, written in a trembling hand. "Come home, Caldwell. It's time." The cockpit dimmed around him. The words were older than this flight, older than the cabin, older than the grief he carried. A voice from a chapter he had burned, but never erased. He felt it again, the cold, fluorescent light of Trauma Bay 2, the sound of boots on tile, the shadow of a man who stood behind him the night his life split in 2. Henry forced his breath steady. "What frequency did the message use?" "That's the strange part," the captain said. "It used one that isn't on our aircraft. Not civilian, not FAA. Something old." Henry's pulse thudded once deep. "Military encrypted band." "Not exactly," the first officer said. "More like a retired tactical channel. Something nobody should still have access to." A soft knock at the cockpit door made them all tense. "It's Mason," came the muffled voice. "We need to talk." The captain unlocked the door. Mason stepped inside, closing it gently behind him. His eyes held the grim knowledge of someone who had assembled too many pieces and realized the picture they formed was worse than the sum. "He's not the one we need to worry about," Mason said. Henry didn't need to ask who he meant. The stranger in the maintenance jacket, the grieving son, the man with the inhaler, He had never been the architect. He had been bait, a test, a spark. Mason continued, voice low. Someone coached him. Someone fed him manipulated files. Someone brought him into this. The captain frowned. But who? Henry stared at the slip of paper in his hand. Someone I once trusted. The plane shuddered softly as clouds brushed against the fuselage. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky stretched endless and clean, masking the storm brewing within the cabin. Mason stepped closer to Henry. There's more. He said the recruiter wanted you broken, that they needed you for something bigger. Something they've been building for years, Henry whispered. They tried to recruit all of us that night, every person in that trauma bay. Except your father, Mason said quietly. He knew too much, and he knew you wouldn't say yes if he warned you. The captain's head snapped toward Henry. Your father, he was chief of emergency medicine, Henry said, and the only one who knew why I quit. Why I disappeared from the hospital. The cockpit fell into silence. Henry felt the old wound reopen, slow and sharp. Mason placed a hand on the headrest beside Henry. This isn't random. Whoever contacted the cockpit is someone who knew your father. Someone who was there the night we lost him. The captain's breath caught. Lost him. Henry didn't blink. My father died the same night as the two brothers in Trauma Bay 2. Different room, same hour, same pattern. The first officer whispered. Are you saying I'm saying? Henry cut in voice, steady as iron, that someone orchestrated 3 deaths and 1 recruitment in a single night. Mason exhaled tension rippling through his shoulders. And they didn't stop when you walked away. The cockpit comm channel flickered again. A faint hiss, then a voice slid through the speakers, low and familiar, the sound of a ghost wearing a living man's breath. Henry. The captain's hand hovered near the radio switch but didn't touch it. Everyone froze. I knew you'd make it to the cockpit, the voice said. You always followed the trail. You always had the instincts. You should never have wasted them on corporate towers. Henry's heart hammered, once hard enough to crack bone. I kept your father's promise, the voice continued. The promise he whispered to me when the monitors flatlined, and you were still in the next room, trying to save someone who was already gone. Mason's eyes widened. No. The voice darkened. He said you would come looking for me someday. He said he hoped I'd be ready. Henry gripped the instrument panel. Show yourself. I already have. Silence. Then a soft thud from somewhere beyond the galley. Mason spun toward the cockpit door. He's on the plane. Henry didn't move. He never left it. The captain's voice trembled. Who is he? Henry turned toward him, eyes burning with the truth he dreaded speaking aloud. The man who took my father's last breath, Henry said, and the man who tried to recruit me into the same program that killed him. Another thud. Closer. The lights flickered. Mason whispered, What do we do? Henry straightened shoulders, rising with a resolve forged in an old trauma bay and tempered over years of silence. We end what started at 12:41 in the morning. The cockpit door rattled softly. Passengers gasped in the next cabin, and Henry Caldwell, the man who had walked away from a world built on secrets, stepped toward the door to face the one secret that refused to stay buried. If you want to know how Henry confronts the past and who's waiting behind that cockpit door, make sure you subscribe, and leave a comment with the 3 words, Stay with me,